Ellen White Reconsidered, a series of presentations for people who have questions about Ellen White's writings. Today, our subject will be Ellen White and the HUSS manuscript. So glad you could join us today. The subject that we're going to take up is going to cover a lot of ground, and it has to do with some research that I published some time back after I corresponded with the author of a paper that has recently been published in book form. This is called Ellen White and the Historians. The original was entitled Ellen White and the Protestant Historians, although it actually has to do largely with just one historian, and Ellen White's use of those writings in her account in the Great Controversy. The author of the paper, which is Donald R. McAdams, was able to enhance his paper, which originally was written in 1974, in 1977, when he discovered that there was a manuscript that was used for the chapter on John Huss. And he was given permission to use that manuscript. He transcribed it and set it up in parallel columns in his original paper, typewritten, a lot of typing. And he had some eye-opening that happened when he was reading this paper, and as he studied it and compared it with the historical sources. His big surprise was the idea that Ellen White had condensed the material from Wiley for this particular chapter. Now, that was a surprise to me because I knew about Ellen White's own statement about how that she condensed sources. In her 1884, it was published as a standalone in 1885 through 1887 volume, there is a minor preface, but it's in here by the publishers. But when Ellen White went to Europe in the 1880s, from 1885 to 1887, she began to see a number of places that she had seen in vision, and she would call attention to some of these major places. And it occurred to her that she needed to expand the Great Controversy from this first edition, 1884, to this new edition. And this is a bigger one. In fact, if you look on the front page, it says right down here, revised and enlarged. So she added in material that she hadn't previously put in there. And one of the chapters that she thought needed expanding was that of Huss and Jerome. And so she did some work to collate materials. Now, before we do that, I want to read to you, or have read to you, what she wrote in the author's preface in here, describing the work that she did in producing a historical work with a particular point of view. That is, to show that the Protestant Reformation was restoring biblical truth and that it was helping God's people to be restored in the earth from the darkness that had covered it during the Middle Ages, as the Catholic Church restricted use of Scripture and also promulgated a number of traditions that didn't have foundation in the Bible. So Huss is a predecessor to Martin Luther. Most people know about Luther and the Protestant Reformation, but Huss is a predecessor, and he was in Bohemia. But let's read this statement.
The great events which have marked the progress of reform in past ages are matters of history, well known and universally acknowledged by the Protestant world. They are facts which none can gainsay. This history I have presented briefly, in accordance with the scope of the book, and the brevity which must necessarily be observed, the facts having been condensed into as little space as seemed consistent with a proper understanding of their application. In some cases where a historian has so grouped together events as to afford, in brief, a comprehensive view of the subject, or has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted. But except in a few instances, no specific credit has been given, since they are not quoted for the purpose of citing that writer as authority, but because his statement affords a ready and forcible presentation of the subject.
So perhaps you can understand my surprise at his surprise that what he discovered was a condensing of history into a short statement, a short chapter on Huss. Now, I back that up as I began to review his transcription. His transcription was a literal transcription, and sometimes he had difficulty with it, with no question. Ellen White wrote in that particular manuscript in a form that was legible to Marion Davis. She was able to interpret it. But for most readers, it would be more difficult, as it was for McAdams. And as I have worked with a number of the original holographs, transcribing letters, sometimes some new ones that we hadn't seen before, with Ron Grable, we have both developed more of a knack to be able to make out some of those sentences that were more difficult, words that were more difficult. I'll show you some of that manuscript, but let me just make the point that when Ellen White was writing to somebody that she needed to write legibly to because they were unacquainted with her handwriting, she would spend the time to more carefully write her letters and to spell things properly as best she could and put in the punctuation. When she was writing to someone that was familiar with her handwriting, due to the shortness of time, she would sometimes send a letter that was a little messier, but understood by the one that she wrote. And sometimes she would even write a little apology. Sorry for the great haste in writing this. I wish I could have been more careful. But when she was writing this manuscript, what I discovered was that page after page, she was looking at the historical source of Wiley. And as she was looking through the story, she was selecting the part of his description that she felt necessary. In a previous episode, I described how that she avoided giving too many details as she was describing a story, telling a story, because that's important when you tell a story. It's as much what you leave out as what you put in. And so she would say a Catholic writer, or a Protestant, or a priest, or somebody. She would identify them generally, but bogging down with the names as a person is reading it through would be distracting. They would say, "Oh, well, who is that? Who's that?" Well, you can go back to the original sources and you can find who these people are, but she was just telling the story. So you tell it in a general way. So as I transcribed from her manuscripts, I could see that she was very much using Wiley, as McAdams recognized, but that shouldn't have been a surprise. She was reducing the story to the essential elements that she wanted to include. And then later, Marion Davis came through and she did kind of a Reader's Digest effect in editing it to tighten it up a little bit more to make it fit within a certain number of pages. Now, what did she put in, and what did the manuscripts include? Well, when we transcribe them and then correlate them with Wiley, you can see the red part, the words that are in red, those indicate words that she has borrowed as she's condensing the story. And then you see large chunks, large paragraphs, where she is applying the material or expanding on it. Sometimes she refers to something that would not be in the historical account, like the presence of angels around Huss or Satan's activity in the Council of Constance. There are a number of indications through there that she's describing something that she saw that was very different from what you would find in a historian. But because she's trying to recount the history, those are quite limited. And most of those, when Marion Davis condense the material were eliminated. The lessons that she used, she applied it, and often compared it to the trial of Jesus and things that were similar from that experience. Those were eliminated because of space constraints. So we don't get to see how much of it was something that she was applying and what she was saying beyond the historians. There are a few other historical facts that are included from some other historians, and those we note in the manuscript that I have prepared. Now, what else was it that was of concern to McAdams as he was reflecting on what he was seeing? Well, one of the major points that has been seized upon by many within the historical community, as well as critics who haven't analyzed the history, and they've taken it for granted, was that Ellen White included the very applications of Wiley and the mistakes of Wiley. And that bore some deeper scrutiny as I began looking at those points. First of all, she didn't make the same lessons. Her paragraphs are very different. The ones that were eliminated were very different from Wiley's. She's telling the same history, of course. That's the accepted view of history that she said in her author's preface as being what she was doing in Great Controversy. But she was also making applications for the reader's life, and those were sadly eliminated. So that part didn't line up. I didn't understand why McAdams would say that she was making the same lessons, because I didn't see that as being the case. And the mistakes, they're largely due to the fact that McAdams relied largely upon the historian Spinka, who was a noted historian of this period and of Huss's life, and refers to his departures from Prague. Looking at my paper and the responses to McAdams' notes, this is from his note on page 67. He says, Huss did not leave Prague at this time. He did leave Prague after a second interdict was enforced in October of 1412, but it is clear Mrs. White was referring to his first interdict, for she mentions two. There were only two. This was the first one, so on. Well, my response was that Huss's own testimony is that he had 3 departures from Prague, 2 of which were before the 1412 interdict took place, and that he did return to preach twice. So this contradicts McAdams' assertion here. And these are the words of Huss himself right here.
And thus I relied on the counsel of God and of many men, the latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to unlace, and on these words of St. Augustine, and who took myself off when men sought my life. For the people were well supplied with the word of God and cared for in my absence, and their other spiritual needs were satisfied. Then I returned and again preached. And when at the king's orders a meeting was to be held to aim at an agreement, then I once more departed after my people had approved it during a sermon. But when nothing was attained at this meeting, I resumed my preaching, although I had been forbidden to preach. Then when the interdict stirred the people deeply, since none could be baptized and no dead buried, and therefore great disorders were to be feared, I left once more.
Okay, so what we have here is that there are 3 departures. 1, when men sought his life. 2nd, during the king's meeting for an agreement. And 3rd, after the interdict took effect. Now, it took a while to figure this out, but Ron Grable and I went back and forth on this to untangle it, and we found out that the first departure was when he refused to go to Rome, and that was in 1410. That was because they sought his life. The second departure was when the king ordered a meeting, which was after Zvidnek, who was the archbishop, tried to impose an interdict in 1411. But when nothing was attained at this meeting, Huss resumed his preaching. The third departure was not until the effective interdict of 1412. Okay, so all of this paints a different picture, and I'm sure that it's confusing for people to look at this. We went through and I looked at each of the different historians. Bonachos, who is the Wiley's source, he was correct in his description of two of the departures of Huss. However, he shifted the departures and therefore garbled the order of the events. Then I mistakenly attached the second departure when the king's order to a meeting in 1412. Actually, it was before that in 1411, leaving myself unable to figure out when the first departure took place. Wiley followed Bonachos, and he described two departures. And though he gets the years right, he connects the description of the results of the 1412 interdict with the interdict in 1411 that the king blocked, leaving the reader to conclude that it was brought on the very actions that would result from the interdict in 1412. Fudge, who is a more recent historian, apparently understands the chronology, points out that Bonachos has it confused. However, Fudge doesn't deal with the three departures to help us see how Bonachos was actually right to say that Huss departed when he did, according to Huss's own testimony. So Fudge misses there being three departures and not just two, and he also misses Bonachos's shifting of the departures. Two other historians, Rubicek and Calmer, have all the facts in Huss's summary of his departures, but they do not overtly connect his summary of the departures to the events that Huss described. So it leaves us missing. Now, we come to Ellen White, and how did she deal with it? She's a non-historian. She doesn't have the advantage of what I have to be able to use Fudge and to correlate and find where Bonachos's mistakes were and how he had shifted it and how Wiley misunderstood it. But here is what Ellen White says. She's correct in her description. Even though she was following Wiley, for she has the two later interdicts, gets them in the right years, and she describes the city of Prague as being filled with tumult after the 1411 interdict, which it was, even though it was opposed, as we said, by the king, blocked by the king. Her only fault is that she does not point out that the tumult in Prague was not because of the usual effects of interdict. It was a tumult of a different sort. Then she gives a general description, and this is where McAdams doesn't like it. She gives a general description of what took place under an interdict, and that aligns with a similar general statement in Matthew Spenka. Okay? So he missed this point, and so he faults her on that fact, but Ellen White is the one who gets it right. She talks about the departures when they actually occurred. She talked about interdict, but she says it in general terms, and she does not say that that's what exactly caused the tumult. There was a tumult. She's right about that. The only thing she could have clarified is to connect it a little bit more directly, but cut her some slack. She got it the most right of any of these historians, and she's not a historian. So if you're interested in more of the details, there are other matters, more minor matters that McAdams thought were errors that I have pointed out in my paper. You can check the link in the description box, and you can go to my paper on academia.edu and review it for yourself. This is a little bit longer, but it deals with some pretty important things. Well, thank you for stopping by, and God bless you as you continue to reconsider the blessing of Ellen White's ministry.